Welcome dito sa ating forum on financialization and debt. Pinapalad tayo ngayon kasi talagang medyo bigatin yung mga ating mga speakers, no? Mamaya ko na siguro papakilala, pero para simulan yung ating program, gusto ko sanang tawagin si Dr. Rene Ofreneo ng School of Labor and Industrial Relations ng University of the Philippines. Please, Rene.
Okay. Good morning, everyone. Can you hear me? Okay. Isang maalam at mapagpalayang araw sa atin lahat. Ito pong dinaraos natin na webinar. Bahagi po ito ng continuing pagsusuri ng Freedom from Debt Coalition sa kalagayan ng bansa at ng mundo sa tinatawag na utang. Next week po, October 10 to 17, ito po ay dineklara ng maraming mga grupo kasama na sa panguna ng Asian People's Movement on Debt and Development. Ito ay Global Week of Action sa issue ng utang. At ang isang panawagan po nila na nakapaliwanag ay magkaroon ng makatarungang solusyon sa utang na ngayon po ay naging isang pandemya sa buong mundo. 2008 to 2010 ay merong debt crisis na hinarap ng maraming bansa, lalo na sa mga developed countries. This time, ang krisis po ay pandaigdig na mas malawak at napakaraming bansa sa Asia, Africa, Latin America, at even sa mga developed countries ang namimilipit sa issue ng utang at kabuhayan. Pero dito sa Pilipinas po, a sense of urgency tayong hinaharap sapagkat ang isyong malaki, can we avoid another debt crisis similar do sa naranasan natin noong dekada 80? Matatandaan po, dekada 80, 90 at yung unang dekada ng milenyo.
Hello.
Yeah, naririnig nyo?
Hello.
Hello? Hello? Okay? Yeah. These are lost decades for the Philippines. At ngayong sinasabing nakakabangon na tayo, nagkaroon ng pandemya at sabi nila, sino ba tumatawag ko?
Hello. This is Butch Montes. Hello, Rene. Kumusta?
Hey, Butch, welcome. Thank you. Okay. Butch, I'm just giving some introductory remarks, okay? So you will be introduced properly by Tony
Hello.
of the Third World Network. Ay, Zina, medyo nag-connect si Butch. Okay? Hello?
Yes, sir. Go ahead lang po.
Okay,
can you recognize later?
So, ito po
Good morning, Sir Butch. Later po. Yes, sir, Rene, go ahead.
So, Butch, I'm just trying to give an overview. We have a series of discussion already on debt. Pero nakikita natin na medyo may problema sa Pilipinas na malaki. Ang panawagan po ng NEDA at DOF, iniintay lang nila ang bakuna and then we'll be back to normal. We declare we cannot go back to normal. And then the old normal is not also a good idea to return to. So, katulad po ng panawagan ng Asian People's Movement on Debt and Development, we need debt justice, we need climate justice. Well, the end is we need a new economic order at hindi po pwedeng bumalik sa dating normal, which is unequal, unsustainable, and very, very uncertain for us, very precarious, nararamdaman po natin lahat. So we hope itong pagpupulong na ito ngayong maga sa pangunguna ng ating dalawang magiting na sila po ay global scholars and yet at the same time global activists at higit sa lahat nananatiling mga Pilipino. So mapapalalim pa natin ang ating posisyon at ano ang magagawa natin sa mga darating na hindi po buwan, kundi mga darating na araw sapagkat titindi at titindi ang labanan na ito. So welcome mga kaibigan, welcome sa webinar na ito. Thank you.
Maraming salamat, Karine. So narinig na yung rationale kung bakit tayo nandito. At salamat at in-emphasize ni Karine kung gaano kagagaling at kung gaano kalawak yung mga karanasan at pag-aaral na ginawa ng ating mga distinguished guest ngayon. So, uunahin ko na ipakilala sa inyo, as if naman kailangan nyo pa ng introduction, si Dr. Walden Bello. Si Walden ay currently professor ng sociology sa State University of New York sa Binghamton or SUNY Binghamton. At the same time, siya, research fellow sa Center for Southeast Asian Studies ng Kyoto University sa Japan. So, dati rin siyang member ng House of Representatives, dati siyang congressman. At ang pinakamahalaga na ginawa niya habang siya ay nasa House of Representatives ay mamuno ng Committee on Overseas Workers Affairs. So, without further ado, gusto sana nating anyayahan si Dr. Walden Bello.
Hello? Okay.
Yes, Walden.
Okay, maraming salamat Rene and Tony. Maraming salamat sa imbitasyon nyo na dito sa ating pulong ngayon tungkol sa debt and financialization. No? At ang mundo ay dumadaan sa isang malaking krisis ngayon, yung COVID-19, tinatawag natin. Pero sabi nga ni Dr. Ofreneo, kasama rin dyan yung krisis ng debt at financialization. No? At of course, dito sa Pilipinas, nandoon na rin yung krisis politika. No? At pero yung tatalakayan natin ngayon sa presentation ko is yung international debt economy. No? So, meron akong hinandang PowerPoint at kung maaari, puntan tayo sa PowerPoint at babasahin ko isa-isa yung mga slides. Hindi masyadong mabilis, pero yan ngayon ang umpisa natin. Okay, so yung first slide.
Go ahead, sir.
Hello,
I'm just having a
Coach
technical
Montes.
problem. Go ahead lang, Sir Walden, to wait lang for a while.
Okay, sandali lang po mga kasama. Inaayos lang po yung PowerPoint. Medyo konting technical issues lang po. Mag-antabay lang po tayo sandali.
Go ahead, Sir Walden.
Yeah, hindi pa rin lumalabas yung... Ayan, okay. Good. And I think si Butch Montes already joined us. So, hi, Butch. And
Hello, this is Butch Montes.
Oh, hello, Butch. Yes. It's great that you've joined us. Okay. And so I will just go through the presentation At tingnan natin. Yung slide, please. Sina. Okay. So, debt, COVID-19, and the International Monetary Fund. Next slide, please. Yes, next slide, please. Okay. So, first of all, one slide back, please. Mukhang napabilis yung... Hindi. Page 2, please. Okay. First of all, thanks to my friends, Dr. Rene Ofreneo and Executive Director Sina Maglinong, and host for today, Tony Salvador, for inviting me to participate in this important event. Second, debt and financialization is a huge topic. So what I would like to do is to narrow down my topic to debt, COVID-19, and the International Monetary Fund. So doing this also makes it topical, since next week, the IMF and World Bank will be holding their annual meeting in Washington. The two institutions are 76 years old this year. They're older than me and Donald Trump. This will also tie in with the global virtual rally to cancel the debt of countries in the global south that is timed for the opening of the annual meeting. I think a notice was passed out globally over the last few days about this virtual rally. Next slide, please. Okay. So a rose by any other name is a rose, says the poet. And we might add the IMF, whoever is its public face. The IMF, for most countries of the global south, is the bearer of bad tidings. As COVID-19 races through the developing world, some people have seen the IMF as a savior. And the fund's new managing director, Kristalina Georgieva, has consciously cultivated this image, calling the pandemic, quote, truly a crisis like no other, unquote, and promising that, quote, we have the whole 1 trillion lending capacity of the fund at the disposal of our members, unquote. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Okay. Unfortunately, some governments in the global south have such short memories and are likely to fall again for the fund's con game that, quote, this time is different because we've changed, unquote. Those of us with longer memories still remember the mea culpa of the fund following the Asian financial crisis of 1997-1998, when billions of dollars worth of what were called rescue funds went to bail out the foreign creditors of the troubled Asian economies, and the austerity programs the fund recommended, which pushed them into recession instead of helping them to avoid it. As the fund admitted in a famous memo, and I quote, the thrust of fiscal policy turned out to be substantially different because the original assumptions for economic growth, capital flows, and exchange rates were proved just drastically wrong, unquote. Next slide, please. Following the Asian financial crisis, there was allegedly some serious, quote, soul-searching at the fund. Something new was expected when Dominique Strauss-Kahn was chosen managing director in 2007. The Frenchman was not shy about announcing his Keynesian as opposed to neoliberal credentials. often quoting Keynes to that effect. And this is one of his quotes. The outstanding faults of the economic society in which we live are its failure to provide for full employment and its arbitrary and inequitable distribution of wealth and incomes, end quote. At the level of high policy, there was indeed some questioning of traditional fund approaches, such as pro-cyclicality or cutting back on government spending while the private sector was falling into recession, as happened during the Asian financial crisis, or the negative, the negative view of capital controls, unquote. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Hello.
Slide 7, slide 6, sir.
Slide 6.
We're in slide 7 now. Up.
No, it's not showing up on my screen. Hindi lumalabas sa screen ko.
Opo, sir, wait lang. Baka signal lang ninyo, sir. But it's already in the screen po.
Huh?
Rhetorically, Strauss-Kahn, that slide, sir, right?
Yeah, right. But what could be wrong here? It's not appearing in my screen.
Probably, or ano po, signal po, technical issues.
Zina parang hindi rin nag-a-appear sa akin. Isa iba kaya, Karen nakikita niyo ba yun?
Nakikita.
Okay, sorry.
Nakikita ko rin.
Pero anong slide?
Ayan, okay na.
Yung mukha ni...
We're now in slide 6, sir.
Wala eh. Ang slide ko still slide, I think slide 5 pa rin. Wala pa rin 6.
Sa akin, it's fine.
Oh,
Yeah.
Sir, it's
Okay. Okay. Now it's okay.
on the side.
Okay.
Just go ahead.
Okay na.
Okay. So rhetorically, Strauss-Kahn indeed broke with IMF tradition with his advocacy of aggressive government intervention to counteract the collapse of private financial institutions at the outbreak of the 2008 global financial crisis. There were, however, no changes in the fund's approach to its developing country clientele on the ground. Balanced budgets and austerity measures in the name of warding off inflation continued to rule, even if this tipped economies into stagnation or recession and knee-jerk advocacy of privatization. When Strauss-Kahn resigned after attempting to rape a chambermaid in New York in 2011, his replacement, fellow French citizen Christine Lagarde, was expected to continue Strauss-Kahn's declared aspiration to mitigate neoliberalism in its policies. It is indeed a puzzle while her reign at the fund from 2011 to 2019 has been described as a time that, quote, the Keynesian worldview has to some extent become the norm at the fund, unquote, as one publication put it. This can only be attributed to the triumph of image over reality. For Lagarde presided over the most savage neoliberal programs in IMF history as part of the so-called Troika, whose other members were the European Commission and the European Central Bank, unquote. Next slide, please. Okay, austerity in Ireland. One of the countries subjected to the so-called IMF cure by the Troika was Ireland. In return for a loan of 85 billion euros to pay its creditors in the aftermath of the 2008 crisis, Ireland was subjected to what the New York Times described as, quote, the toughest austerity program in Europe, unquote, involving the loss of about 25,000 public sector jobs, equivalent to 10% of the government workforce, as well as a 4-year, $20 billion program of tax increases and spending cuts like sharp reductions in state pensions and the minimum wage. Unquote. Next slide, please. Next slide, please.
We are on the 8th slide.
Okay, having let's see now. Having surrendered sovereignty in 2010, three of Ireland's top economists asserted with little exaggeration, quote, the Irish state remained in effect a protectorate of the Troika until the end of 2013. The country went through a 2-year recession in 2008 and 2009, followed by several years of stagnation until 2014. The unemployment rate rose from 6.4% in 2008 to 13% in 2014. Especially hard hit were the young, with development NGO Oxfam reporting that as of February 2013, 30.8% of the country's under 25s were unemployed. And those in chronic long-term unemployment accounted for close to 62% of the total number of those out of work. Inequality was also on the rise, with those with the lowest income seeing them fall by more than 26%, while those with the highest saw theirs rise by more than 8%. Ireland, noted Oxfam, is likely to see rising inequality over the coming years as it struggles to maintain the redistributive mechanisms in place prior to the financial crisis. Unquote. Some 610 people left the island between 2008 and 2015, or close to 13% of the country's population of 4.58 million people. Next slide, please. Okay. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. That's already been read. Okay, the crucifixion of Greece. The crucifixion of Greece by the Troika is, of course, well known, but it is important to remind ourselves of this extremely painful experience. In return for 3 bailout packages consisting of 186 billion euros to pay off Greece, private and multilateral creditors, and a much ballyhooed 107 billion euro debt write-off, the Troika imposed conditions that included the following: cutting public employees' wages by 70%, reducing pension benefits above 1,200 euros a month by 20 to 40%, raising the retirement age from 65 to 67, loosening labor legislation, and selling off 50 billion euros worth of public assets. It was the same pro-cyclical policy that the fund had taken to Thailand, Indonesia, and Korea during the Asian financial crisis of 97 to 98. That is, cut government spending, the social benefits and services, and channel savings to pay off the loans to the banks, even if this meant cutting domestic demand and condemning the economy to stagnation or worse. Next slide, please. Not surprisingly, as one analyst pointed out, and I quote, the more the government cut, the worse the economy suffered. The International Monetary Fund was later forced to conclude that the damage to economic activity from deficit cuts had been badly underestimated. With no recovery for sovereign debt and with the downturn eroding private borrowers' ability to service their loans, Greek banks sat on growing unrealized losses. They were unable to channel credit to those private sector companies that might have expanded So a credit crunch compounded the fiscal austerity to depress the economy further, unquote. Next slide, please. Lagarde tried to play the good cop to the bad cop, Germany's finance minister Wolfgang Schäuble, pretending to be more sympathetic to Greece. Greek Prime Minister Alexis Tsipras, however, accused the IMF of, quote, criminal responsibility for the Greek tragedy, while Finance Minister Yanis Varoufakis described the fund and its partners, the European Central Bank and the European Commission, as a, quote, small group of bailiffs disguised as technocrats who supervised the implementation of a super austerity program, quote, designed to cause visible pain to the weakest Greeks, unquote, that boiled down to the dismantling of basic social welfare provisions, unquote. Next slide, please. Okay, with Bulgarian Kristalina Georgieva succeeding Christine Lagarde, like it did during the the 2008 global financial crisis, the IMF propaganda machine is again working at high speed to project the image of an institution bravely and swiftly and compassionately stepping into the role of de facto lender of last resort to counteract the ruinous effects of COVID-19 on the developing world, ready to deploy a war chest of $1 trillion to this enterprise. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Are we? Hello? Can we move to the next slide?
Yes, we're on slide 15 already, sir. Or you want to go back to slide 14?
No, we want to go to ano ba ito? The next slide, from an opportunity to clean up a bad image, we now move to the next slide. Is that 16? Okay. Something is not quite right, though. As of wait.
Yeah.
Something is not quite right, though. As of mid-June, the fund reported having committed only $245 billion of that vaunted $1 trillion, despite the fund's earlier claims that many countries were knocking at its doors for emergency assistance. One would think that governments would be leaping at the fund's offer as COVID-19 burns a destructive path through their economies. They are, however, being very cautious. These are, after all, loans, not grants, that would increase the already high levels of indebtedness of many countries. So next slide, please. Along with the G20, World Bank, and other multilateral donors, the IMF has assembled a so-called debt relief program. The response of developing countries has also been surprising. As of July 18, only 42 countries had requested an estimated $5.3 billion in relief, less than the approximately $12 billion that it had expected in April, would be requested by 73 eligible countries. But the organizers should not have been surprised, for what was billed as debt relief was really just debt restructuring or refinancing. Next slide, please. What was offered was merely a suspension of debt service payments falling due between May and December 2020. As one economist, Barry Herman, points out, and I quote, the payments would not be forgiven, but would be repaid over 4 years, including a grace period in 2021. Interest will be charged on the delayed payments, making the offer essentially a refinancing loan with no elements of a grant, unquote. Moreover, the IMF and multilateral development banks, to whom developing countries own a significant part of their debt, are excluded from moratorium coverage, which is limited to voluntarily participating bilateral or government donors and commercial banks. Unquote. So next slide, please. Also met with little enthusiasm is a related debt relief program for 25 African countries to the tune of $20 billion, assembled by the IMF, World Bank, G20, African Development Bank, and all Paris Club creditors. The initiative has found few takers, with only 4 countries, Cameroon, Cote d'Ivoire, Ethiopia, and Senegal, making applications. While there are a number of reasons for this, a major one is that, quote, the terms of the multilateral debt relief and loan packages will restrict future policy direction. In other words, it will lessen policy space. As pointed out by one analyst, the debt moratorium is being granted on conditions that the funds are spent only on critical public services. Other conditions include adhering to existing policies, reporting requirements, multilateral oversight, and transparency. Countries under the debt relief program are not allowed to incur debt from any other creditors during this time, and they should use savings only to address shocks from the pandemic, unquote. Next slide, please. The African countries are displaying a very rational response. They witnessed the way the fund had mercilessly squeezed Greece and Ireland, 2 countries that, being European countries, one would have expected the European and American-dominated fund to be more lenient with. Equally important was Africa's own terrible experience with the fund over the last few decades, where, as Oxford economist Near Woods pointed out, the latter stuck to its austerity approach in its structural adjustment programs. Quote, even as studies of the IMF and the World Bank themselves failed to elicit positive investment effects, unquote. Next slide, please. As Kevin Watkins, head of Save the Children, wrote in October 2018, and I quote, the pace of global poverty reduction is slowing and the number of extreme poor in Africa is still rising. On current trends, there will still be more than 3 million preventable child deaths in 2030. Progress on malnutrition has stalled, and an increasingly knowledge-based global economy in which automation threatens jobs, 617 million children are either out of school or set to emerge from school lacking basic literacy and numeracy skills, unquote. Watkins singled out for criticism the IMF's, quote, fiscal policy straitjacket that accompanies loans and undercut social spending, unquote. Despite COVID-19, African governments did not want to fall into the fund's hands again, or for those that had existing fund programs to fall deeper into its clutches. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Next slide. Zina?
Yes, sir. We're slide 20 po, moving to 21. Given the immensity of the challenge, that's slide 20 po.
Okay. This is the slide after Africa's problems, right?
Yes
Oh,
po.
yeah. Okay. Given the immensity of the challenge, the fund, were it really serious about helping countries, should just have heeded the call to cancel the debt of developing countries to private, multilateral, and Western government creditors, or lend without the usual tough conditions. But it has simply brushed this off, saying that its policy is to advise its members to stay current on their obligations to the extent possible, unquote. As for simply writing off its own loans, Not even the grim conditions of a pandemic, the fund says, can allow this since, quote, under its charter, it is not permitted to simply cancel claims or write off debt, end quote. Next slide, please. The World Bank, incidentally, was more forthright when asked about why it simply did not cancel the debt. David Malpass, the new president appointed by US President Donald Trump, did not hesitate to say that the reason why that the financial markets wouldn't like it. It is worth reproducing his rationale because it shows that for the key institutions of global capitalism, a pandemic, no matter how serious, must not be allowed to interfere with the relationship between creditor and debtor. Regarding the continuing calls by some parts of the UN to extend the moratorium to debt repayments to MDBs, he said, quote, this would be harmful to the world's poorest countries. MDBs, multilateral development banks, depend on financial markets, and instability in the payment stream would have a negative impact to the flows to client countries, end quote. So don't disturb financial markets. Okay, incidentally, apropos the World Bank, Department of Finance of the Philippines figures show that from January to June of this year, the government has program loans worth 216.3 billion pesos, roughly 4.4 billion US dollars for coronavirus response, including 85.8 billion pesos, roughly 1.74 billion US dollars from the World Bank, and 130.5 billion pesos or 2.6 billion US dollars from the Asian Development Bank. The Philippines' outstanding debt soared past 9 trillion pesos, roughly 183.9 billion US dollars as of the end of June, as the government borrowed more to fight the COVID-19 pandemic. The Philippines' debt to GDP ratio before COVID-19 struck was at 39.6% in 2019. Next slide, please. But back to our topic. Some experts have advocated that the fund create special drawing rights, SDRs, for developing countries to draw on, so they won't have to seek restricted emergency loans. SDRs are reserve assets created by the IMF whose values are based on a basket of strong currencies like the dollar, the euro, and the yen. A member's contribution or quota is denominated in SDRs, and quotas can be enhanced by creating more SDRs, a decision that is made collectively by members of the fund. In the context of the COVID-19 emergency, it has been proposed that SDRs be used for settling debt-related transactions among members of the IMF. However, the IMF has also brushed this suggestion aside. So for those countries that do come to the fund for assistance, the fund is saying, don't expect much loosening of conditionalities and surveillance, even under pandemic conditions. Quote unquote, debt sustainability will be the key criterion in determining who will be given loans, meaning that, quote, the IMF is required to establish before it lends that the borrowing country's debt is sustainable, and by implication, it will be able to repay that debt, unquote. Managing Director Georgieva has herself admitted that, quote, the fund assesses the health of institutions in each and every country. And there are some countries who have not been able to provide emergency financing because they haven't satisfied our safeguards. It is not like everybody who came in, we said, okay, here it is, your check. We do have requirements. Countries have to submit a letter of intent. And in this letter of intent, they take on certain obligations. Many of them have committed to do ex post audits so we know what they spend the COVID-related money on and how effectively, end quote. Next slide, please. Okay, next slide, please.
Yes, sir. You're on slide 25, right after the slide before.
Yeah, but it's not showing up. Is there a problem? No? Okay, the rigor of this surveillance process is laid out more explicitly in a fund paper. And I quote, all countries receiving emergency financing must commit to undertake a safeguards assessment. These assessments provide reasonable assurance to the IMF that a central bank's framework of governance, reporting, and controls is adequate to manage resources, including IMF disbursements. Where there are shortcomings, IMF staff make time-bound recommendations and closely monitor their implementation. Given that emergency financing is provided as an upfront disbursement, such assessments will be conducted after the disbursement, but before the approval of any subsequent financing for the member country under a more traditional multi-year financing arrangement. Unquote. Next slide, please. Okay, in short, except perhaps for the speed of the disbursement of the initial tranche of a COVID-19 related loan, countries should not expect any loosening of conditionalities or surveillance when it comes to pandemic-related loans from the IMF and its sister agencies. Despite Georgieva's characterization of the pandemic as a crisis like no other that only comes once in a lifetime, unquote, the IMF is the same old agency with the same old unchanging neoliberal perspectives and processes, unquote. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Are you there?
We're on slide 27 already, sir. This is not all surprising.
Yeah, but it's not showing. Okay, this is not at all surprising, for the same power realities continue to hold. Despite over 40 years of reform efforts, no change in the power equation in the organization has taken place. The United States holds 16.5% of voting power, which continues to give it a veto over any change in the Articles of Association or in major policies of the fund. Next to the US, Europe is the fund's most powerful bloc, though key developing countries now have collectively a greater weight in the world economy. Next slide, please. Next slide. As Robert Wade and Jacob Vestergaard point out, quote, today the four big BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, China, have a combined share of world gross domestic product of 24.5%, compared with 13.4% share of the four big European economies, Germany, France, Britain, Italy. But the four BRICS countries have a combined share of votes of only 10.3%, compared with the four European nations' share of 17.6%, unquote. Long demanded voting power shifts from developed to developing countries have been very marginal, coming to only 2.6%. So the more things change, the more remain the same. Moreover, the European countries continue to hold on to a very feudal privilege in one of the most important institutions of global capitalism, which is the right to always have a European as managing director. Like her predecessors, Strauss-Kahn and Lagarde, Georgieva is heir to this feudal prerogative that makes a mockery of universally accepted norms of meritocracy. Next slide, please. In sum, the COVID-19 pandemic has provided the IMF an opportunity not to save the world, but to clean up its image. 2, the debt relief program that it is trumpeting is really simply debt restructuring or refinancing with no real relief at all. 3, repayments to the IMF and the World Bank are sacrosanct, since according to the IMF, Georgieva and the bank's malpass, the global financial markets won't like debt cancellation. 4, whatever COVID-19 related loans the IMF gives out will be subjected to the same conditionalities and surveillance as previous loans. 5, the lending behavior of the IMF and the World Bank reflects the continuing power structure in the two institutions, where the US and Europe call the shots. Despite over 40 years of calls for reform, what changes have taken place are very marginal. So what to do? Our call should not only be to cancel the debt. To this, we must add 76 years is enough. Phase out the IMF and, of course, its fellow agency, the World Bank. Okay, thank you very much. That's it.
Okay, maraming salamat, Walden. Thank you very much to Walden Pelio. Maganda ho yung mga sharing ninyo at saka mga analysis nyo patungkol sa IMF, sa World Bank. At maganda rin mapakinggan na maraming hihiling. Next week kasi yung meeting ng IMF, October 12 to 18, at maraming hihiling na ikansela yung mga debt ng lalong-lalo na ng mga third world countries. So yung susunod nating speaker, again, mapaalad tayo, bigatin ulit ang ating speaker. Nagtapos siya ng kanyang PhD sa ekonomiya sa Stanford University sa Estados Unidos at pagkatapos nun ay bumalik siya sa Pilipinas para magturo sa University of the Philippines. Sa ngayon, siya ay Senior Advisor of the Society for International Development. I guess without further ado, gusto ko sanang i-introduce sa inyo si Dr. Manuel F. Montes, pero mas kilala natin siya sa pangalang Butch Montes.
Narinig
Butch,
ba ako?
please. The floor is yours.
Ito na, si Butch.
Yeah.
Maliwanag.
Butch, maliwanag.
Okay.
Maliwanag,
Okay.
Butch. Maliwanag.
Okay.
Okay, maliwanag.
Meron akong PowerPoint, no? So, first of all, gusto ko lang sabihin na reluctant ako sana magsalita dahil wala akong masyadong alam sa Pilipinas. Sinusundan ko yung international financial system. So, nagpadala ako ng PowerPoint na you can distribute widely. But I want to just go through the PowerPoint if that is possible, no?
Yeah.
Ano ba alam mo, iba pala itong software na ito, no? Hindi ito Zoom, ano?
Jitsi to, Butch. Jitsi.
GT.
Jitsi.
So, kung yung PowerPoint ko mapakita ang anong, ayan, okay, ito. Sama. So I'm going to start it now, no? So first of all, I'm very honored to be invited. Maraming salamat, Zina. Maraming salamat, Rene. Matagal na akong hindi masyadong naki-involve sa Freedom from Debt Coalition, but I was involved in the beginning, no? So I'm very happy to see na maganda yung logo nyo, no? And I'm very happy to see na tuloy pa rin yung ginagawa ninyo, no? So if I can have the next slide first, ito yung pinaka main idea dito na yung title nitong aking presentation is that yung pandemic, ang mangyayari niyan, ang worry ko is that you're avoiding the disaster of the pandemic by causing a global development catastrophe. So it will be like a loss again in development success, no? As far as countries are concerned. Now, ang specific problema is that it's a health disaster, but of course, like other health disasters, kung infection, it's self-limiting, no? But the development impact can be quite permanent, no? So what has been happening is that the governments have had to think about doing their own fiscal spending in order to reduce the permanent impacts like the deaths and disabilities, hunger and dislocation of families, enterprise bankruptcies, which will result in jobs permanently lost, no? So, and the question is where to get the fiscal resources when actually most of the countries, developing countries, a lot of them are already in trouble in terms of debt, especially the poorest ones. And the main theme that I have here is that haphazard external borrowing will likely cause a development catastrophe. Merong ingay sa background, ano? So I don't know what it is, pero anyway, I hope you can hear me, no?
Yeah.
So what I can say is that after COVID-19, there'll be an increased debt overhang, and it will be widespread because it affects all countries. And it will be the case that a lot of the uh, yung word swaps dyan means that most of the kinds of responses to the debt problems will be in a form of a swap, but they will limit the development policies in the future. So, yung aking slides, may I have the next slide? I'm saying what is the underlying problem of the global financial system, no? And what I say is that the underlying problem, and this is why it won't be solved soon, is the question that it is the outcome of a level of inequality globally. As you can say, it's an unintended consequence of neoliberal policies, in which the inequality is both the feeder and the driver of financialization. Anong financialization? Financialization is a system in which all economic activities are measured in terms of their financial return, no? And ang financial return, ang pinaka-importante sa financial return is capital gains, no? Which is a short-term kind of thing. It's not investing for the future. It's not investing in physical assets. It means just investing in other financial assets, no? And what is actually happening, then one of the views I have underlying here is that there is a lot of money for responding to the pandemic and actually dealing with development issues. But the problem is that because of this inequality, a lot of debt is being pushed on to the developing countries, especially, in order on the excuse that they need fiscal space to undertake the response, no? But it's a very big opportunity, particularly for the private sector, no? Marami ako example dyan about how, for example, in my slides, no, how the private sector is probably salivating. Parang they're very much interested in lending, no? Because the problem is that they're sitting on a very huge pool of money that is earning 0% in the developed countries, no? Yeah, so itong what is investing in a financialized economy? Well, as I said, it's a very unequal economy. The rich make money from the value of their assets and manipulating tax rules, no? So there's an emphasis on capital gains, and the capital gains can be made actually nanosecond to nanosecond, no? And there is no big priority now on actually investing in equipment so that it will hire more people, because the problem is that a real economy, a real enterprise means more cost. You know, if you hire more employees, it means more costs. It can lower the stock market. It will take you 30 years to recover the cost of the equipment. And therefore, the whole global economy now is oriented towards investing in other financial assets, no? Can I have the next slide, please? Maybe I should speed up, you know, I'm taking too long, no? So ganyan yan. That's the reason why there is a lot of money. I mean, this is my underlying argument that as far as the private sector especially is concerned, they have a lot of money, no? So there's unlimited funds. In April, Indonesia borrowed 4.3 billion 50-year bonds, no? And that's probably the longest bond that was sold in the region, no? That has been sold in the region. Longest in terms of term structure, no? The Philippines itself is borrowing at 3 to 4%, no? Now, in Africa is borrowing at 5 to 10%. You have to understand that the private sector is borrowing at basically 0%, no? The cost of funds is basically 0%, no? So, is that the question is, after all of the borrowing, what do you do with the debt, no? There will be parang a a set of people are calling it disorderly debt defaults, no, over the among developing countries, no. So one of the ways in which you can figure out the debt is you swap it for bonds that pay higher interest, no. So this is a form of strategy that will actually result in even more debt. Ito yung nangyari nung 1980s debt crisis, no. Another one is debt for policy reform swap, no, which is like part of the yung mga structural adjustment programs. They also result in more debt because then the private sector that was trying to collect the debt from the before the policy reform are paid back from the amount of money that the developing countries borrow, but the developing countries don't get any of the money. No, for example, they are forced to liberalize their trade, thinking that if they liberalize their trade, they can invest in more competitive industries. But at the same time, they're not given any money. There is no money that is devoted towards the cost of the investment into other kinds of economic activities. The money went towards repaying the previous debt. The other one is what I call debt for patrimony or strategic location swap. This is the Chinese style kind of thing na nangyari sa Colombo, sa Sri Lanka. No? The Chinese lend a lot of money. The Chinese actually operate like private sector lenders. No? They lend a lot of money, and they when the country gets into trouble, they ask for in the case of Sri Lanka, they ask for a 99-year lease, no, on a harbor that gives them a strategic location in the Indian Ocean. No? And the other one is the debt for nature or climate swap. That would actually also mean restrictions for on climate change reasons, and it prevents countries to do more for climate change than even what the developed countries are doing. So for me, this is an incoming development catastrophe. Can I have the next slide, please? So the next slide, please. I can start talking kung hindi gumagalaw yung slide, no?
Debt bandage, sir. The slide of debt bandage is already.
The debt bandage, yung debt bandage, kon lang yun, no? Parang it's just a harking back to the 1980s crisis. And I have in that slide a quote from Neil Ferguson, a well-known political scientist, well-known for being a proponent of the positive impact of colonialism, no? And actually, yung quote na yan, says na yung mga conditions that are coming in through the Washington Consensus would have made the heart of a British imperial administrator 100 years before very happy, no? So in effect, a lot of the policies that are used for these kinds of swaps. So first of all, you get into debt trouble, no? And after you get into debt trouble, you go to the IMF and you go to the World Bank, no? And when you go to the IMF and the World Bank, they will give you money, but the money is really intended to pay back the private creditors. Nung nag-umpisa yung debt crisis nung 1982, the deposit money banks in New York, which were the main lenders to countries like the Philippines and Argentina and Brazil, yung claims nila against the developing countries constituted 88% of their balance sheet. So if any country at that time would have managed to declare bankruptcies, and if a whole set of countries declared bankruptcies at the same time, what would have happened then is that the financial system of the United States would have collapsed, because a lot of these deposit money banks of New York were actually the underlying financial system of the world, no? So they were actually rescued by by austerity in the developing countries. They were rescued partly by the money that came from the IMF and the World Bank that was passed through back to the private lenders until they could shore up uh, their balance sheets, no? But in the meantime, syempre, yung IMF and the World Bank had some ideas about what is required for development, and this it turns out to be what is required for development would have been the same thing that the British would have wanted their colonies to have done 100 years earlier. So can I have the next slide, please? So this is like just a warning against getting into debt problems and then running to the IMF and the World Bank to help you get out of the debt issue. No? So ito yung debt for liberalization swaps, no? And they were called structural adjustment loans, but they were not for particular investment projects. They were there's a schedule that the government must, for example, reduce the tariff rates according to a particular schedule. And if they do that, the money will come in. But the money will come in only to be paid back to the private creditors. And actually, at the bottom of that slide, I asked some questions na those programs didn't even ask the right questions, no? Because if you are going to borrow money, you have to make sure that you generate dollars either from more exports or from savings and imports. But none of the programs of structural adjustment actually provided for more exports or more reduction in imports, no? In many of them, actually, it reduced the government's ability to collect tariffs and to collect taxes. So in effect, the government, which was the borrowing conduit, actually had even much less money to pay back. And of course, what would happen is that the governments would cut back on social expenditures like health, no? Right now, we're in a health crisis, or on public investment like infrastructure, no? And of course, there was a lot of dislocation, no? So ngayon, parang ang worry ko ngayon is that this kind of thing is about to come back again on a parang widespread basis among developing countries. Can I have the next slide, please? Can I have the next? So the next slide is about, I have my one here, you know? China-style lending. You know? I've already talked about this. No? So another way is yung swap nito is that it's like a private creditor. I will collateral, di ba? It's a collateral value. So in effect, is what I mean by China behaving like a private lender. There's a collateral value, no? So in effect, if you cannot pay your debt, you have to give them something in return, and maybe a part of your territory, no? So this is something that we have to be careful of. Ang nangyayari dyan is that many countries in Africa and Latin America have been borrowing from China, but the debt of China has not been consolidated with other debt. And what is happening now is nagkakagulo in Africa and in Latin America, because it turns out one of the reasons why China is unable to pay why the developing countries are unable to pay their other debt is because the Chinese claim is more senior to the claims of the other creditors, no? For example, the private banks and all that stuff. So eventually, magkakaroon ng awayan between China and the other private lenders to developing countries. No? So can I have the next slide, please? Yeah. The next slide is called ngayon ito bago ng fashion ito. The next slide is called the new fashion of SDG bonds. So nagkakagulo dahil debt cannot be repaid. So instead of structural adjustment loans, there is now a new PAD about lending for sustainable development goals. And actually, my main worry about these kinds of lending is just like before, in structural adjustment loans, they will not result in more exports in order to pay back the loans or, reducing the imports. They could also cause a lot of dislocation in the domestic economy. No? Yung nangyari dito, ang magandang example dito is that in the middle of September, a lot of countries were already in trouble, di ba? In the middle of September, Mexico was able to borrow 890 million in sustainable development bonds. No, it was called a historic first, and actually it was 6.4 times oversubscribed. So the private sector is looking for people to lend to, or countries that are to lend to, but now they themselves have gotten into directly to the structural adjustment loan business, whereas before it was indirect, no. So now they will lend money, but of course because it will not, and yung second paragraph dyan sa slide na yan is the same as the one under structural adjustment loan, because the loan will not guarantee anything that will allow you to pay it back. Then you're going to have another restructuring, and you will end up being in debt for a longer time, and maybe at a higher interest rate. No. So the next slide, please. Okay, so ito yung mga other ways to create fiscal space na and how to avoid a development catastrophe. One is a general allocation of SDRs, no? An allocation of special drawing rights. Yung SDR, I mean, I think na-mention na rin to ni Walden, is that actually it is a creation of the members of the IMF. Ang problema dyan sa SDR is that syempre the biggest proportion of the allocation, because the current system is to allocate according to contributions to the IMF, most of the money will go to countries that do not need the extra money. When a central bank gets that money, it can use it to pay off debt, it can use it to import medicines, it can use it to build up its hospitals and all that stuff. But most of the money will go to the developed countries. No? So, meron kailangan na parang maneuver dyan in which the IMF is the mediator. We can talk about that in the open forum. Pero you will have to get those countries that do not need their allocation to donate their allocation for other countries that have debt problems. Another one, itong DSSI na mentioned dito ni Walden. DSSI is the debt service suspension initiative of the IMF and of the G20 and the IMF and the World Bank. No, the World Bank is not really part of it yet, but it's the IMF. That means that they're suspending the payments. No, but the problem is, as Walden said, is that actually it's a restructuring of the debt. No, it delays the payments with a grace period, and it is only available to a few countries. No. The other thing, the next bullet point is really an overall global change in the debt architecture, no? And what I have there in the front of it is that I'm saying that external debt is too cheap, no? Because of the impunity of irresponsible lending and the unrecognized climate change costs. So what can happen is that there should just be a cancellation of the debt. You can do the cancellation. You can write off. You can have a debt audit, so that then you can have a moral standing while you're canceling the debt, and you can follow all due debt procedures. By the way, itong third bullet point, as far as I can remember, this has been the position of Freedom from Debt Coalition, right? So you can operationalize an odious debt procedure. For example, in 2003, the United States managed to get a Security Council resolution that protected the assets of Iraq from being uh, confiscated by its debtors, because by that time the US was already controlling Iraq, no? And that allowed Iraq to make write-offs, write-downs of the debt that they had, no? So yung number two dyan is to say that there should be a rules-based impartial sovereign debt restructuring mechanism which doesn't really exist right now. And the other way to avert a development catastrophe is to end tax evasion and avoidance. Most developing countries do not collect enough taxes in order to fulfill their development ambitions. This is in exchange for, or instead of issuing SDG bonds, no, Sustainable Development Goal bonds, which cannot really actually, within the way I can read the way their terms, their term sheet does not really create the foreign exchange to pay back the SDG bond, no. So these are the proposed, these are the the kinds of things that countries can consider. Can I have the next slide, please? The next slide talks about the problem with each one of these proposals, no? Yung FDR, actually, pinopose na yan, but the US has a sort of effectively a veto power. The US does not want it. Ang aking own forecast, fearless forecast, is that magkakagulo-gulo, magkakaroon ng disorderly defaults all over the world after the pandemic. And then that's when the US will allow the SDR allocation. But just like the structural adjustment program, the allocation will only be applied mostly on the condition that it will be used to clear the arrears that the borrowers, the debtors, are supposed to pay back. So they will not see any of the money, no? The debtors will not see any of the money. Now, in the case of the debt suspension initiative, as I think Walden also mentioned this, only 41 have applied for it because they're afraid that they will lose access to the private sector lending. In the private sector, they want to borrow from them, and even the poorest African countries have actually been able to borrow from the private sector. No, they've been able to what they call float euro bonds. No, and actually, yung debt suspension initiative, China is not participating. The regional IFIs, for example, Asian Development Bank, is not participating. The private sector is also not participating. And what private sector is threatening to do is to trigger a default event, which means na babagsak yung bond rating ng country, tataas yung interest rate, and then they will have a problem with their assets that they happen to have left abroad. No, it can be garnered by private through court procedures. No, it can be garnered by private creditors abroad. No. Now, itong debt write-off, there is also the same fear with the DSSI on the part of many debtor countries. The point I'm making here is that it is, the problem here is how to maintain unity among the developing countries. No, lalong-lalo na the Latin American countries like to they are now saying that we are going to sell SDG bonds. This is how we're going to sell the pandemic, di ba? And there is another parang a maneuver which the African ministers had proposed in August about no change in the debt system, but there will be a special purpose vehicle that can count it as if they are paying back their debt, even though they are not really paying back the debt. And finally, yung sa tax evasion and avoidance, ang problema yung OECD, they have standards on taxes. I think Tony Salvador knows a lot about this, di ba? and he can help explain it too. But they want to make sure that the multinational companies do not have to pay their taxes where they are where they are putting their mines and all that stuff. So let me get to the last slide. I think this is the last slide. I know that yung last slide is about what to do right now, no? Given that first of all, the developing countries are not united, you have the Latin Americans selling SDG bonds, you have I also think that most of the finance ministers of Southeast Asia are actually very much in the same mold as not wanting to lose their credit standing, no? Not to lose their credit standing. So the last slide says, what are the policy options when you have the same, supposing you have the analysis that I have, right? There's no problem with money. There's unlimited money. How do you try to keep the South united about forcing into the uh, overall debt restructuring, overall debt reform, transforming the debt architecture globally, which I think is the underlying position of the FDC, no? Uh, well, I look at the problem in two parts. One is South unity among countries and South unity among civil society, no? And I think it will be, first of all, I don't think many of the other uh, uh, proposals I have in the previous slide will actually solve the debt problem, no? The only solution to the debt problem is a change in the overall debt architecture, no? And by the time COVID-19 disappears, many of the liquidity crises that we have now will actually be insolvency crisis, no? And by that time, I'm expecting the IMF will have analytical papers saying every country is different. This country is different from that because ganito, ganyan, ganyan, ganyan. But actually, the common pattern is that they have a problem which prevents them from restarting investment and restarting their growth, no? And by that time, their ability to service the debt, which has increased because of the COVID-19, has already been weakened by the pandemic. So I'm not sure that the South countries can stay united to pursue any reform in debt architecture. So for me, the bigger problem is will civil society be united, no? I would say that if they are united into an overall, this is my view, no? And syempre, you know more than me. I have not been involved in civil society for quite a while, no? But I'm saying if they're united towards fundamental debt architectural reform, it will be easier to be united at least in the future. Now, what I'm saying is that right now, the problem is that civil society, which is based in different countries, has to find ways of working with the governments and engaging with the specific governments because each government has its own idea about what to do, and all of them are avoiding any discussion about reforming the total debt architectural system. So we have to help them, no? We have to explain to them that a lot of things are not really, you can borrow money now, but if you don't generate, yung simple problem lang, no? If you don't generate the dollars, how can you ever, why should you even borrow, no? At this point, no? You might as well tax the rich. You might as well force generate your own domestic resources in order to respond to the pandemic. I think that's the last slide. So thank you very much. I'm very pleased to have been able to present to FDC again after a very long time. Thank you.
Sir,
Okay,
can you
maraming
open
salamat
your
po.
video so we
Thank
can
you
see
very
you?
My video. Bukas yung video ko. Hindi nyo kami makita.
Hindi po
Approach
eh. Pero just
naka-close na
maintain
yata.
po.
Kasi yan, ngayon yan na video, alam mo, hindi ko alam itong software nyo eh. I'm more used to
Zoom.
Zoom. I can see all of your videos, by the way, no?
Yan,
And I
nandun ka
can
na.
see my own video,
Yan,
but
nandun ka na.
I cannot see your video. Ano ba ito? Ano ba? Kasi alam mo, fax, ano yan? Ang ginagamit ko kasi Firefox. Maybe I should use another, alam mo, baka mamaya merong yung Firefox ko, merong, anong tawag dito, firewall. No? Pwedeng kuan.
Pero, Butch, Firefox rin yung akin eh.
Ayun.
So,
Oo.
Yan, nakikita ka na.
Nakikita ko yung lahat eh. Pero hindi nyo ako makita, ano?
Nakikita ka rin.
Sige
Nakikita
po,
ako,
sir.
yan. Kumakaway ako.
Okay.
Nakikita.
Sige po.
hindi natin mag-Butch eh. But, yeah. But
Opo, I think you should be using you should be using all Chrome po.
Okay. Next
See
time I
natin,
will
Chrome
use
is the browser. So, no worries, sir. Pasensya po.
Firefox is good. It works as well.
Sige.
Hindi ko alam kung bakit hindi
but,
nag-work. Oh.
Hindi ko makita.
right now with what we're using, right now with what we're using as the official of moderation for the technical po,
Okay.
Chrome sana. But
Chrome,
no worries po. We heard you and hopefully, we can, I will post your picture na lang po para we know who you are here.
Okay.
For the benefit of the others. Go ahead, Sir Tony.
Okay,
Sir
maraming
Tony,
salamat,
go ahead.
Butch.
Sorry
Yun
po.
po si Dr. Butch. Opo. Okay, sige. Sige, maraming salamat, Butch. Yan po si Dr. Butch Montes na nagbigay sa atin ng maraming at mayamang mga discussions katulad ng mas naunang discussant, si Dr. Walden Bello. Salamat, Dr. Butch. Mahalaga siguro i-highlight natin yung ilan sa mga binanggit niya. Halimbawa, yung financialization of the economy na madalas nating maririnig, kung saan yung mga funds na umiikot sa buong mundo, no? Imbes na ilagay sa real economy, meaning para mag-produce ng goods, para sa mga pabrika, instead nilalagay siya sa mga bonds, securities, derivatives, etc., para mas malaki ang kita at saka para mas mabilis ang kita at mas mababa ang taxation. Pinoint out din ni Butch yung cut sa social welfare, lalong-lalo na ngayon sa pandemic, kung kailan pa ba naman na kailangan natin ng maraming funds para lalong-lalo na sa mga marginalized sectors, doon pa nagka-cut sa spending. Tapos yung problema rin ng debt service suspension initiative na hinahain sa IMF tsaka sa World Bank, na kung saan hindi naman totoong cancellation of debt, hindi naman totoong debt relief, parang nire-restructure lang yung ating debt. At yung napakahalagang issue ng tax justice, yung tax evasion, at saka even quote-unquote tax avoidance na kailangang i-address ng international community at ng mga individual ng mga bansa. At finally, binanggit ni Butch yung pangangailangan ng unities, lalong-lalo na sa southern countries. But at the same time, binanggit din niya na baka magkaroon ng problema dahil sa mga iba't ibang framework. Halimbawa, iba yung pag-iisip ng mga kapatid natin sa Latin America, iba rin yung pag-iisip ng mga kapatid natin sa Africa patungkol sa unities pagdating sa pag-restructure ng debt architecture. Pero don't lose hope. Ang sinasabi ni Butch, importante din yung unities na kailangan nating ma-build tayo sa civil society, sa iba-ibang at mga kapatid natin sa iba-ibang civil society sa ibang bansa. So with that, maraming salamat ulit, Butch at saka Walden. So susunod ko pong ipapakilala, mapalad po tayo ulit. Last but not the least, siya ay magbibigay ng mga reaction sa mga naunang mga nagsalita. So, ibibigay natin sa inyo si Alex Aquino, si Mr. Alex Aquino. Siya ay isang progressive economist sa ngayon ay financial advisor sa mga local banks. Nga pala, siya ay isa sa mga founding members natin sa Freedom from Debt Coalition. Pagkatapos noon, nagtrabaho rin siya sa London at after that sa Hong Kong. So Alex, gusto naming marinig ang reaction mo pero feel free to also give your additional inputs. Maraming salamat. Take it away.
Maraming salamat. Narinig po ba niyo ako?
Oh, Alex, maliwanag.
May problema palagi ho ako rito sa aking camera, sa Zoom. Kaya malamang hindi niyo ako makikita. So, sorry na lang po roon. So, hindi ko alam masyado kung anong ibig sabihin ng reactor. Pero, ang isang point po na nakita ko lang, naalala ko nung nakikinig ako sa isang lecture ni ginawa ni dating Treasury Secretary ng US na si Timothy Geithner sa isang forum sa Yale University. Nung ina-analyze nila kung ano talagang fundamental reason ng crisis noong 2008-2009. Basically, in a certain sense, sinabi niya something that is similar to what Walden and Wood said. It was basically a question of too much money globally looking for higher returns but at very low risk. So, ang iniisip ko, yung binanggit ninyo tungkol sa financialization, hindi question ng lack of money. It's actually a situation where we have too much money chasing after very few high returns on investment, at least from the capital markets point of view. So, yung binanggit mo, Tony, tama yun. Sa tingin ko na one of the main trends that we are facing today is that too much money is being spent on other than productive activities. And these themselves become products that are traded or dealt in the capital markets. A feature of this is an element called shadow banking. And it is defined as borrowing from the money markets in order to lend to the capital markets. It's something that we need to also watch out for. So, ang isang tanong ko lang is there any documentation of how much of that money is circulating around the globe that are not being spent on productive activities, and whether there is something that we can do about it? Yun lang po ang aking nais i-share. Pwede ho bang makuha ang reaction ni Butch or ni Walden?
Yes, Butch or Walden, baka meron kayong gustong itagdag o gustong i-react dun sa sinabi ni Alex. Otherwise, nakita namin na nakataas ang kamay ni Lidi. Si Lidi, baka may gustong idagdag. And after that, si Ed.
Yung calculation in terms of circulating, that is, among the different financial institutions, private as well as public, but mainly in the private sector, it does, it moves in the trillions of dollars, no? As far as I know, even just na lang yung mga hedge funds and similar kinds of funds, $100 trillion, one of the estimates that I've seen, is what is moving around, and looking for easy investments, short term, that can then yield even greater profitability than reinvested back into profitable investments within the financial sector. So we're talking about a real huge sum of hedge fund and private equity funds, money, circulating at this point in time. Yes, it's not a question of there's no money. It's just that it's in the wrong hands.
Thank you po.
Okay, maraming salamat, Walden. Maraming salamat din nga pala, Alex, sa napaka-importanting tanong na pinost mo, no? Siguro si Butch, baka merong gustong
Meron akong graph. Meron akong graph dun sa na pinadala ko na yung nasa slide 24 at saka slide 25. Actually, ang kwan dyan is that all investment eventually becomes a physical asset, di ba? Or investment, original investment is a physical asset. Halimbawa, lupa o equipment o pabrika, no?
Yeah.
And then ang nangyayari, o kaya halimbawa, humiram ka ng pera para bumili ka ng bahay, di ba?
Yeah.
So the standard way of doing is may mortgage ka, di ba?
Yeah.
Siyempre, di mo unless mayaman na mayaman ka, babayaran mo yung buong one-in-one with cash. Most people do not do that, di ba? So ang kanyan is that then meron kang mortgage, yung mortgage na yun nagiging financial asset yun, nagiging security, nagiging bond, no? Tapos yun nagiging derivative, tapos lumalaki ng lumalaki. So pag pinakita niyo yung mga kwan, ganito yung anong nangyari yan, kung ba yung lupa lang yung physical asset, yun lang ang physical asset, nagkakaroon ng kung ano-ano klaseng mga securities. And yun ang nagiging pinangguguluhan ng mga financial guru, no? So I think 24 and 25, ewan ko ba yung number na ngayon, baka nagpalit yung number. The previous one too, the previous one is the one I'm talking about, no? Kaya nangyayari nga dyan, itong other graph na pinapakita is that naghahanap yan ng pahihiraman, no? Yung pera na yan. Because in the end, yung pera na yan, alam mo, it earns a very low interest rate. So nagkakaroon ng booms and busts sa finance. Tapos pag nagkagulo-gulo, pagbibitangan nila yung countries, no? When actually, during the time that the debt was being built up, it was being built up dahil sa naghahanap ng pahihiraman yung mga financial sector. So what you actually do, you have a very unstable pyramid, na because you're not really investing in equipment, you're not investing in improving the land or the productivity of the land, you're not improving in real physical goods. You are actually just playing around with the money and trying to make money from capital gains, no? Tapos yung pa, very low on tax rates noon all over the world dahil siyempre all the countries are they are competing with each other in order for the investment to go to their financial sector, no? Kasi if they tax the capital gain, there are jurisdictions, halimbawa Switzerland or ano na hindi I know that's not true. Switzerland actually still has a wealth tax, but most governments do not have wealth taxes anymore because they want the wealthy to invest their money in their own financial sector, where they can play around with it also, and then they can invest, they can lend it to developing countries. Yun lang ang kwan. Yun ang kanya merong inverted pyramid yan na very unstable. Tapos nagkakaroon ng mga episodes na nagkakagulo, no? Dahil na nasusobrahan yung paghihiram sa mga countries na hindi naman pala kaya magbayad, no? Or the loan didn't produce anything that will allow the loan to be repaid. No?
Okay, maraming salamat,
Thank
Butch.
you.
At salamat, Butch. At in-emphasize mo lalo yung difference ng tax treatment sa capital gains at saka sa ordinary income na tayo sa FDC matagal na nating ina-advocate, no, na dapat yung parity, no, walang asymmetry yung dalawa kasi yung isa yung capital gains para sa mga hindi naman talaga nagtatrabaho at yung isa yung sa ordinary income para sa mga nagtatrabaho at saka nag-i-invest sa agriculture at saka totoong mga services. Kung wala nang dadagdag ang ating mga speakers, si Alex, si Butch at si Walden, gusto ko sanang anyayahan si Liddy na magbigay ng... Yes, Liddy, please.
Salamat, Tony. Actually, may dagdag lang at saka may tanong. Sa debt relief, parang update lang dun sa pinresent. Then, meron actually debt relief program yung IMF to cover IMF debts, yung debts to the IMF. Yan yung in-offer nila na 500 million that will come from their Catastrophe Containment Relief Fund or Trust, CCRT, which works this way. Maka-cancel talaga yung payments nung 24 countries at hindi sila magbabayad for several months. Yung debt payments nila for several months maka-cancel. Pero if i-finance ng IMF yon through that trust, which means yung trust na yon na nagpe-pledge at nagko-contribute yung mga mayayamang bansa, mababayaran din siya. So some are questioning that this is not actually a cancellation on the part of the IMF dahil babayaran siya ng mga mayayamang bansa through their pledges. Pero from the point of view of the borrowing countries, maka-cancel din naman talaga ang debt payments nila for 6+ months kung kailan mag-run out yung inallocate na pera. So far, about 250 million has been availed of by nearly most of these 24 countries. Pero IMF credit lang ang involved. Ang multilateral banks, totoo yung sinasabi ni Walden, wala talagang ino-offer na relief yan. The World Bank, in fact, is offering more than $100 billion loans for COVID, but they're not offering any kind of debt cancellation or debt relief. Yung suspension, it's really the G20 and it covers only bilateral loans for voluntary governments. At yan, meron na rin may konti na rin lumabas and it's really because yung minention ni Walden at nabanggit ko na rin dati na ayaw nga mag-access nitong mga bansa because they think their credit ratings as insofar as borrowing from the financial markets will be affected. So yun lang yung dagdag na parang sa data lang on debt relief, Walden. Merong IMF na maliit na cancellation of IMF credits. Yung sa sinasabi ni Butch, may tanong lang ako, Butch, kasi meron ngayon among energy campaigners pinaglalaroan na idea na it's some sort of a debt swap or I would rather call it a debt conversion kasi ang campaign is for all lenders to stop lending or financing fossil fuel projects. At matagal na rin demand yan ng climate justice groups na dapat wala ng further expansion ng fossil fuel industry, which means kailangan i-stop na yung financing. Yung idea ng debt conversion is for all outstanding debts related to fossil fuel projects ay i-convert into grants, not loans, grants for renewable energy projects. Kaya gusto ko lang makuha yung tingin mo dun sa ganung idea. Of course, it does limit what you can spend on if you convert those outstanding loans into grants, which means hindi na sila pagbabayarin, ibibigay na yung kung ano yung equivalent nung natitirang utang pa, pero ang kolatilya doon is it to be invested in renewable energy projects. So, totoong meron pa rin constraints on policy, pero meron din naman talagang strong campaigning among civil society groups para mag-increase ng public spending on renewable energy, and this is seen to be possibly one of the ways to do that. Yung last ko lang, yung sa sinasabi ni Alex na shadow banking, importante din talagang pasukin yung issue na yan. May mga ilang groups na rin, civil society groups who want to take it on kasi unregulated banking yan, di ba? Tapos monopolistic. So I'd suggest that FDC also does further study into this issue so it can join other groups in wanting to take on the challenge of addressing shadow banking. Yun lang po.
Okay, salamat, Lady. Gusto sana natin tawagan si Dr. Ed Tadem para magbigay ng kanyang reaction and or questions. Ed, please.
Okay, naririnig ba ako?
Okay, maliwanag, Ed.
Okay. Maraming salamat, Walden, at maraming salamat lalo na kay Butch. Nakita tayo uli ngayon. Nabasa mo na ba yung binigay kong yung kay Oscar Jorda? Yung the rate of return on everything. Sana may comments ka doon. Anyway, hindi yan yung question ko ngayon. Yung question ko will come at the end of my sharing. Parang gusto ko kasing magkaroon ng longer view of this issue of financialization, which is going back in history. Nung late 19th century, nung sinulat ni Marx yung Das Kapital, meron ng phenomena noon ng financialization or finance capital dahil nga sa paglawak ng mga banking conglomerates, especially yung mga Rothschilds. But si Marx, at that time, he thought that industrial capital will still prevail over finance capital. Ibig sabihin, kahit na lumalaki yung finance capital, it will still be mobilized in the service of industrial capital. In other words, it will still be put into the real economy. Even in the case of capital being exported to backward countries. So he was looking at India at that time na gagamitin pa rin daw yung finance capital to serve the real economy, to develop industries in the backward countries, which Marx saw as a progressive development because it will give rise to a working class and overturn pre-capitalist structures in backward countries. But then when Lenin came along, just before the outbreak of the First World War, Lenin also wrote about finance capital dun sa kanyang popular work, yung Imperialism, the High Stage of Capitalism. Pero in Lenin's own analysis at that time, what took place now was a merger of finance capital and industrial capital. And later on, sabi niya, finance capital in the form of the banks, we're now taking we're now dominant over industrial capital, even if there was a merger between the two, so that the development of economic development of backward countries at that time was now dominated by monopoly banks, even if
Hello? Sorry, parang nawala si kasamang Ed.
Nag-freeze
Hello,
ata
Ed.
yung niya eh.
Nag-freeze yata si Ed. Sige, antayin natin si Ed. Pero in the meantime, apparently aalis si Walden in 5 minutes. Walden, baka may gusto kong idagdag?
Well, yung kwan lang, I mean, I think the maganda yung
sorry,
call.
sorry, hindi pa ako tapos, Walden.
Oh, okay.
Okay.
Naputol yung link. So I had to stop talking for about 15 seconds. Yun nga, sabi nga ni Lenin, it would still be used for finance capital, even though dominant over industrial capital, would still be used for the real economy at that time. Although ang caveat niya is that this would not be put into agriculture because because of the low returns, higher costs na gagamitin, plus, and then it would not be capitalism if finance capital would be put into agricultural capital, into agricultural development. So from that situation, you can fast forward, I suppose, to the 1980s when a totally different picture now emerges, which is what we are now discussing and talk about. And that is the total domination of finance capital to the absolute almost disappearance of industrial capital, both in the developed countries as well as in the developing countries, which now marks a new stage in the development of finance capital. So that finance capital now is just in the service of finance capital, nothing else. Money to make more money, rather than money being invested in production and in the real economy. So given this, this historical development, perhaps I can ask Walden or Butch, what will come next? Because right now, finance capital is in trouble. And the crisis of 1998 as well as in 2008 shows that the dominance of finance capital is becoming more and more unstable and unsustainable, even for the holders of finance capital. So after this, what could possibly be the next stage in the development of finance capital? Thank you.
Salamat, Ed. Sige, bigyan natin si Walden ng pagkakataon para sumagot. Walden, please.
Yes. Okay, well, thanks, Ed. Maganda yung na-post na problem ni Ed. Gusto ko lang i-quote dito maganda kasi yung parang na-foresee rin ni Marx ito. Kasi rin sa volume 3, he talks about the what he calls the normal circuit of production of money to commodity to money. And sabi niya, there are times when that gets displaced by the circuit money to money. And this is how he explained it. To the possessor of money capital, the process of production appears merely as an unavoidable intermediate link, as a necessary evil for the sake of money making. All nations with a capitalist mode of production are therefore seized periodically by a feverish attempt to make money without the intervention of the process of production. So I guess during his time, for the accumulation of capital, very necessary pa rin, well, until very recently, yung intermediation ng production process. Pero I think over here, he was already looking to this period, when its finance capital is so dominant, that, it is, activities in finance capital hardly with any relation to the necessities of the productive process. So, ang sense ko lang is that malaki talaga yung mga contradictions that are going to be emerging here once capital or finance capital has detached itself from the productive process. And I think this will result in greater demands for a transition to a post-capitalist system. But of course, that's not going to be easy. So yun lang siguro masasabi ko. Very provocative yung question ni Ed. And it does seem like we are reaching, a very, very, we're reaching a breaking point in terms of the dynamics of global capitalism at this point. I don't see how these contradictions can really be solved still within, a process within a system of capital accumulation dominated by, capitalist social relations. So, yun lang siguro masasabi ko. Thanks a lot.
Maraming salamat, Waldet. Meron tayong tanong mula sa mga nanonood sa ating live streaming, no? Mula kay Butch Ablir ng SM Zoto. Ano raw po ang epekto nito sa buong Build project, sa urban development plans, particularly sa socialized housing projects ng government para sa mga urban poor, at saka ano rin ang epekto nito sa malawakang kawalan ng trabaho. So sino kaya ang pwedeng magbigay sa atin ng sagot o mga suggestions? Hindi siya binanggit kung kanino naka-address yung tanong, pero baka merong gustong magbahagi o magbigay ng kanyang opinion or projection patungkol dito. So ano yung epekto sa Build project? Ano yung epekto sa socialized housing? At anong epekto sa widespread unemployment?
Siguro pwede akong konti lang. Hindi ako masyado alam. Hindi ko alam masyado sa Pilipinas eh.
Sige, Butch, please.
First of all, yung in terms of yung fiscal money that the Philippines is spending on responding to the pandemic, no? The Philippines has the smallest amount in terms of per capita, no? Tinignan ko yung mga numbers recently, parang, hindi ko na alam kung nasaan. Pero sa atin, it's not even 1% of GDP, no?
Yeah.
Whereas Indonesia is 4% and Thailand is 10%, yung pandemic response, no? So, in effect, unlike every other country, hindi tayo nag-i-spend as much as they are for responding to the pandemic. Okay, that's the one side of it. The other side of it, if you look at the Philippine deficit, yung fiscal deficit ng Pilipinas, kasi laki na ng Indonesia at ano. So actually now, halos yung maintindihan mo kung bakit the government is very reluctant to really respond to the pandemic dahil actually, siyempre, kung ikaw si Dominguez siguro, worried ka na baka yung ating BBB band magiging BBB minus or something like that, babagsak yung ating credit rating, no? So, in fact, yun ang nangyayari. Tapos, isa pang strange sa Pilipinas is that imbis na strengthen yung taxes, mukhang itutuloy nila yung corporate tax rate reduction, di ba?
Yes.
And I could be wrong, Pero
totoo.
parang ganun.
Tama yun.
Ha?
Tama.
It's very strange. It's a very strange way of responding to the pandemic. So now you have a lot of people who will be unemployed. As I tried to say in the early slide, there are things that you want to avoid. You want to avoid permanent damage. This is the reason why you must spend now. So one, you want to avoid debts. Secondly, you want to avoid bankruptcy. If a company goes bankrupt, you have destroyed the capability, no? Of course, you have destroyed employment, diba? You have destroyed capability, and then in the case of people who have lost their jobs, you do not have demand, diba? How can a businessman take a risk in investing? Because wala namang bibili ng gamit niya, di ba? Yung kanyang magagawa. So I cannot answer about build. Pero para sa akin, naintindihan ko halos kung bakit the Philippines is parang 1/4 lang ng stimulus ng Indonesia. Kasi ang taas ang deficit. Pero the reason why that is so is because probably our tax performance is much lower than most other developing countries, no? Or other developing countries of the same level of development as we are, no? So talagang masama, no? Masama talaga, and we cannot respond to the pandemic, no? Ganyan. Yun lang ang sagot ko, no? Pwede rin ako sasagot dun sa finance capital. Parang iniisip ko dun sa finance capital na tinanong ni Ed. That's actually quite interesting. Alam mo, let's say when yung kay Lenny na nag-merge, kunyari yung dalawa, actually you can say that from the Marxist point of view, finance has a different role as industrial capital, no? So I would say that it might be a question that now finance is so dominant that everything is measured in terms of the financial aspect, no? Or the capital gains aspect. Ang pinakamagandang example ko dito yung Sears Roebuck, which is a very important it was a very important company in the US, no? Sears Roebuck was built up using parang yung retail yan, no? Retail, no? So actually it hired people, it employed people. It was bought by a hedge fund manager na walang alam sa retail, and then he turned all of the sub operations of Sears Roebuck into separate profit centers. So each of them had to make money financially. And what he actually did was to destroy the what they call synergies, no, between the different departments by turning each one of the departments into one. So now Sears Roebuck has declared bankruptcy, no. But of course, he still made a lot of money. It's not as if that the destruction of Sears Roebuck didn't make the hedge fund manager money. Hindi ko na matandaan yung pangalan niya. I have it in one of my older papers, no? Paper 2 years ago. So this is the situation where actually finance capital by controlling what is happening actually prevents itself, no? Parang it destroys its own except prevents its own growth, no? In the end, no? Ganun, because as I said, all capital is based on some physical asset, no? But then if you keep on just making money out of the money, then you end up then losing the commercial viability of the underlying physical asset. Doon kay Liddy, I find that very interesting, Liddy, yung pagko-convert ng sana ipakilala mo ako sa ginagawa ninyong conversion into grant, no? What would be nice to figure out is siyempre a lot of these power plants, yung coal-fired power plants are actually probably also have a private sector debt, no?
Yeah.
So first of all, I don't know to what extent the public sector is willing to turn it into a grant. It will mean a fiscal maneuver on their part, di ba? They have to ask the taxpayers to do it. But how about the private sector lending to this coal-fired plant? My own view is that even if we succeed in enforcing the IMF and the World Bank and the ADB to stop lending to coal-fired plants, the private sector will be more than happy to more than happy to fill up the space. So what I mean
kami against the private sector financing. In fact, some banks have already responded about phasing out coal investment. Yeah, but
I want to. No, we can talk about this some more. I want to know how we can turn their claims into grants. No, that's actually a very good thing to do, and where we will get the. Almo. I mean, these are people who are very politically important in all of these developed countries. No, is there any kind of maneuver that we can do? So. Kung pwede tayong, if you can introduce me to your friends and all that stuff, I would like to learn more about it.
Sige, Butch, we'll invite you to advise on this kasi we also started the dialogue with ADB already about the possibility of converting this into grants. Sige, I certainly plan to get in touch with you.
Yeah, I want to. I'm very interested. Mabuti, merong ganon actually, no? So, because this is the only way, no? So, Okay, so I hope nakasagot ako.
Maraming salamat, Butch. Malalim yung mga at malawak yung mga binigay mong mga sagot.
Well, sabi ni Walden yun nga, na minsan naaalis yung money, naaalis yung commodity in between, no? So nakita rin ni Mark yun, pero yun nga finance role is different from an industrial role or a manufacturing role, no? So in order for them to merge, somebody has to dominate one, no? So
Sige, so salamat. Bago ko i-turn over kay Ed, may additional input si Ed at saka tanong. Gusto ko sana ipursurin yung tanong ni Butch Ablir ng Soto. So halimbawa, dahil sa mga nangyayari, financialization, etc., ano ba yung ability ng mga SMEs, mga small, micro, medium enterprises na maka-access sa credit? I mean, dahil ba sa financialization, kumukonti yung pagkakataon nila na makautang sa mga bangko, tumataas ang interest, dumadaming dinidemand na collateral, or walang pagbabago o mas madali kasi sobrang daming pera. So siguro baka si Alex, baka pwedeng magbigay na input patungkol doon. So from the perspective of the banking sector at perspective ng SMSE.
It's strange kasi yung small, yung micro, small, medium business sector contributes more than 96% to employment. And yet, kung titingnan mo yung Bayanihan program version 1, yung amount na ino-offer in support is a measly 1 billion pesos. And most of this is actually in the form of loans through a subsidiary of the Department of Trade and Industry. So it's not surprising that it has hardly caused a dent in the problems of this particular sector. Having said that, and taking off from the discussions that Walden and Butch brought, lumalabas kasi kasama rito sa buong usapin ng financialization where the private sector actually ropes in the entire government for its own purposes. Ang social services in terms of the main street, lumiit na nga ang nailalaan na pondo para dito, para pantulong dito o in terms of real investment. Pero yung lalo na yung social services like in health, education, and so on, and many of the structural adjustment programs of before that the IMF was actually, as Butch and Walden said, principally targeted at helping the problematic economies to repay the debt. And as a consequence, many of the investments in health, in education, in social services have been savagely cut. This is true in the poorer countries as it is increasingly in the more advanced countries. You can see that in the UK, you can see that in France, you can see that in Europe, and especially in the United States. Ganun din sa Pilipinas. When it comes to housing, parang isa-isang tabi muna yan. Pasok muna tayo roon sa mas mabilis na makaka-ensure sa atin ng higher return. Well, in terms of that, infrastructure has been a traditional answer, no? And build is just one of the programs that they are deploying at the moment for this purpose.
Okay, maraming salamat, Alex. Ang susunod na magko-comment o magtatanong, si Ed. Pagkatapos ni Ed, si Dr. Ofleneo, si Karen. Sige, Ed, please.
Okay, two things, no? Tungkol pa rin dun sa finance capital, no? Yung in the midst of the 2008 East Asian financial crisis, when I was still with the UP Asian Center, we organized a forum on that crisis, and one of the main speakers was Sixto Rojas Jr. Ting Rojas, who is generally credited with founding the Philippine financial system when he organized Bangcom in the early 70s yata, no? And his talk in that forum was quite revealing. Sabi niya, when he founded Bangcom, he really thought of Bangcom or yung development nga of the financial sector as really going to be in the service of industrial development. That Bangcom was supposed to raise funds to develop the industrial sector. In other words, the manufacturing sector. And I think he was also thinking of developing the agricultural sector. So, but that did not come about. Ang nangyari is from Bangcom, lumawak yung financial sector ng Pilipinas, and it went the same way as the financial sectors in other countries. In other words, the financial sector was just there to serve the financial sector. And in that forum, sabi ni Sixto Rojas, he deeply regretted forming Bangcom. Sabi niya, mea culpa. I wish I had not done that. If I had known that Bangcom would be the precursor of a huge financial sector that would only be meant to service itself and not the industrial sector. So medyo nakaka yung shinare ni Ting Rojas sa amin noon. Secondly, dun sa build, no, I think under the Duterte administration, the same build program will continue. Nagkaroon kasi ng conflict within the cabinet, no, among the economic managers tungkol dito sa build program. When Ernie Pernia was still the Director General of NEDA and concurrently Economic Planning Secretary, I think nagbakbakan si Pernia at saka si Dominguez because Dominguez wanted the same thing to just go on, no? Developing build the same way the Aquino administration done that for big ticket infrastructure projects such as dams, roads, highways, subways, etc. Si Pernia naman, ang view niya, and this was what he shared actually when in a meeting where we were both together. This was already after he resigned. Although sabi niya, this is confidential, so maybe we should keep this among ourselves. Sabi niya, what he really batted for was a build program, but for social infrastructure, especially in COVID-19 times. Sabi niya, yun yung gusto niyang maging priority ng Duterte administration. And by social infrastructure, he meant housing, health, especially education, and other types of social services. Pero natalo siya dun sa conflict nila within the cabinet. And I think this is one main reason why he threw in the towel and resigned as NEDA Secretary General. Dahil his was a lone voice within the Duterte cabinet. Yun lang.
Sige, maraming salamat, Ed. Medyo magandang sharing yun. Si Dr. Rene of Reneo, hinihintay nating magbigay ng comment.
Okay, maraming salamat maraming salamat kay Walden, kay Boots, kay Alex na nakasama ko pala sa NEPA dati, National Economic Protectionism Association. Now, my question is a bit different sa mga topics na discuss natin. You know, every week, ang Bureau of Treasury nag-o-auction ng treasury bills. Nakakakuha siya ng 5 billion, 7 billion, 10 billion, kumisan 15 or 20 billion a week. And kumisan yung mga nag-offer na bibili, ang tataas, mga 50 billion, pero ang natatanggap, mga ganun nga. So, in other words, every week po yun, ang tawag nila ay auction market. And so it came to pass na 3/4 of our national debt ay domestic debt. Mainly, if I, sa aming mga initial discussion, ang mga big players dyan ay siyempre mga bangko. Pero meron din silang minimit sila ng central bank pero at saka ng DOE. Pero meron sila ring association ng mga T-bill traders. And then meron pa mga secondary or tertiary market. Hindi ko maintindihan yung dynamics. But the banking industry of the Philippines, parang ang naging primary business is not lending to industry or agricultural development. Agricultural development, kitang-kita yung matagal ng kinikriticize na halos walang credit na going to agriculture. Sa industry, gayon din po. So, alaro sila, parang ang main business ng Philippine banking is itong treasury bills. And then in the meantime, our banking industry under structural adjustment has also been deregulated, by the way. So, marami dyan may partners din ng mga international banks, but wala naman nag-aaral kung magkano yung mga sharing nila. And of course, lately, they are also involved siguro dito sa bill na sinasabi. So, 3/4 of our national debt ay owed to sa itong mga buyers ng treasury bills na karamihan ay commercial banks. And then yung the rest, itong ang external debt, pero meron diyang karamihan dyan na rin yung mga multilateral, bilateral, plus meron din mga commercial. So how do we deal with a situation like this? If I understand it, medyo lumaki ang domestic borrowing or dependence on T-bills magbuhat nung 1990s, again on the urging of the IMF World Bank and their structural adjustment na so nagsimula. But of course, the economy also at the time became more and more dependent on overseas remittances. At yung remittances ngayon umabot ng last year, maabot yata ng $3 billion a month. But ngayon is going down. I don't know how sustainable is the present arrangement. And then, of course, marami tayong proposal on what to do with external debt, with the IMF, with the World Bank. But how do we deal with this big domestic lenders na of course, dominated by this the big type funds, the mga siguro 100 ng big commercial banks yan. So, it is an issue na hindi natin sasagot. Now, regarding to sa bill na question, our position is, yan naman bill is dulo yan ng programa ng privatization ng government. Nagsimula sila sa privatization ng mga corporations na foreclose ng PNB, DBP noong 1980s, pumunta sa how to solve the power crisis, nag-BOT, mamaya naging EPIRA, tapos maya-maya nag-focus sila sa mga public infrastructures. And today, ang programa ng NEDA at DOF ay yun nga, buhayin muli ang bill, pero yung bill ni Duterte na iba sa bill sa program ni Gloria at ni Noy Aquino, kasi si Gloria at si Benigno Aquino nakafocus sila sa PPP, Public-Private Partnership. Pero itong kay Duterte, dilagdag nila yung government spending and government mobilizing ODA. So dito pumasok ngayon yung mga inchik, the Chinese, and then kasama na dyan yung mga sinasabi ni Butch na lending for patrimony and swaps of patrimony. And very clear yan in the case of Kaliwa Dam and some other projects na dinidenounce ni Justice Carpio sa column niya. So, but itong build, tayo naman nag-position na sana okay, ituloy yung build at PPP, but i-focus diyan sa survival needs of the people, i-focus dito sa community needs, hindi dito sa mga big ticket projects. Katulad, may subway project na napaka-expensive from sa Metro Manila, iba pa yung subway project ni na Binay, may mga projects na kinoconnect yung ilang islands na mga tinatawag nila mga bridges. So just very expensive. Ang mas kailangan ay yung how do you rebuild yung mga communities ng urban poor, rural poor, coastal poor, kasama na yung mga housing and so on. So in other words, we are not against, well, personally, I'm not against spending, but magamit ito ng maayos at tapos yung spending, so yung issue ng quality and quantity. But anyway, going back to the original issue, given this reality ng debt structure ng Pilipinas, how do we deal with the 3/4 na is all domestic debt and lumulubuhot talaga ng husto? So I hope to get an answer from Walden and Boots and even to Alex. Salamat.
Okay, maraming salamat, Karine. Merong gustong mag-share? Siguro si Alex or si Butch o si Walden.
Meron
Iba pa
lang
natin
isang
makasama.
galit na, meron akong question about yung kay Rene ang tinanong. Pwede?
Oh, sure. Yes, please.
Kasi actually, yung pattern na nakita natin with many other countries, and hindi ko alam nga kung totoo sa Pilipinas ito, is that non-residents have been actually buying local currency bonds, no? So in effect, when you say domestic debt, no? How many of those are actually meron kaming table niyan actually, like even in the case of like Peru, halos 50% of their local currency bonds are actually being bought by foreigners, no? So I don't know how do you classify what is domestic debt? Is it only because it is peso denominated or not, diba? And to some extent, if it is non-residents buying those bonds, magiging problema pa rin yan pagka nagkagulo-gulo, you know, because they will try to sell the bond and they will ask for the US dollars in order to leave the country, no? So it is not a real solution, but it's some kind of a cut. So for me, there's an important research issue here about whether a peso debts that are denominated in pesos are automatically counted as domestic debt. Now, the other thing about domestic debt, if you, as Rene was trying to say, how do we solve this? No, well, of course, there's no one answer. But the first thing to say is that if the demand, if the incomes of people are too low domestically, there is no demand. It makes a lot of sense for businessmen to really just put their money and lend to the government, diba? As long as the interest rate is reasonable, no? So yun ang. So if you're not actually increasing the domestic level of real economic activity, yun ang gagawin talaga ng mga bangko. The other thing is that syempre, if you want to restructure that debt, meron ka problema. You have pool of funds like GSIS and SSS, diba? That also rely on buying those bonds in order to be able to fund the pension system, no? So anyway, yun ang answer ko diyan. Domestic debt is a very interesting issue, and we have to understand first of all where it is coming from. Maganda yung sinabi ni Rene na baka mamaya it's only coming from the big domestic banks. So my question there is, to what extent are those non-residents anyway? And to what extent can that, alam mo, yung sinasabi ni Ed Tadem na yung Bangkok problem, di ba? How do you solve the Bangkok problem? One way to really solve the Bangkok problem is to have a faster growing real economy, no? That does not that prevents the rich from putting their money into just lending to the government. Anyway, yun lang ang sagot ko, no?
Okay, salamat Butch. Meron pang ibang gusto magdagdag?
Baka si Alex, merong alam siya, marami siya, naka-involve siya sa mga bangko mismo eh.
Sige Alex.
Well, is there a way, is following up on Butch's point, is there really a way to identify who is investing? Well, that's one question, no? It might
So
be
sa BIS,
a
you can
worthwhile
find
project.
something. Merong BIS, hindi ko alam, you can look at the BIS, ang tinatawag dito is net external position, no? Halos every month, ina-update yun eh. And then nakalagay kung anong klaseng mga BIS tables ito, no? Na may mga ibang klaseng kinds of financial instruments. I haven't done it, so I don't know. Pero that's very interesting to know whether non-residents din yung bumibili ng mga government bonds, no?
Well, I can understand if, for example, a relatively wealthy PhilAm were to take a look at the local bonds dito na nag-o-offer ng 3.5, 3.75% per annum net.
Yeah.
Tapos i-compare to how much he's going to get it in dollars in the US. Well, I mean, the choice is obvious, no? So that's just a PhilAm. Kasi relatively mataas ang offer dito sa central
yung mga hedge funds din, di ba?
Yeah, pero ang problema sa hedge fund, medyo mas mataas ang risk eh. Kung mga retirees na pinag-uusapan, I think collectively they'd be more conservative. But anyway, that's just off my... Pero I think, people like Eli Remolona can probably take something, I mean, retired na naman siya, no? Following up on your suggestion to look at BIS.
Meron mga BIS tables eh. Parang net international position ang pangalan ng mga tables, parang gano'n.
Pwedeng tingnan.
Sige, salamat. Pero, sorry sa ignorance. Ano nga ang BIS?
Bank of International Settlement.
Okay. Salamat. Sige,
Sa
meron pang...
Basel.
Sa Basel, well?
Switzerland.
Okay, sa Basel. Okay. Sige, maraming salamat. Meron pang gusto magdagdag o magtanong? Si Lady?
Yung isang point na gusto.
Sure. Go ahead.
Pwedeng observation lang. Kasi yung kanina, labas yung sulpot-sulpot yung point na yung private sector, particularly the financial sector, in relation to the government. Tapos i-relate yan doon sa usapin ng power of finance capital. Are we noticing something over the last 40 years regarding the rowing in? I don't know the exact word. It's like the private sector or the big corporate sector roping in entire governments. So that one feature that we can look at in terms of, say, neoliberalism and the financialization of the economy that comes with it is even the dominance of the corporate sector and its ability to make use of government resources for its own ends. Is it something that we should be looking into?
Yeah.
Actually, sa maraming larangan, ginagawa natin yun. Yung corporate capture ng government at saka ng discourse. Pero siguro, anyanyahan ko si Karen baka mas marami siyang maibabahagi patungkol doon. Pero in the meantime, gusto ko sana sabihin, yung, ano yan larangan yan na ginagalawan ng marami sa atin, including na nandito sa call na to. Halimbawa, yung sa ISDS, yung Investor State Dispute Settlement na nilalabanan natin. Halimbawa, yung proposed legally binding instrument on transnational corporations. Ano rin yan, no? Katulad ako, at saka yung mga grupong Third World Network, at saka mga iba pang groups focus on the Global South. So nag-a-advocate tayo na magkaroon ng ng isang UN legally binding treaty para mapanagot natin yung mga transnational companies. Pero syempre, ang kalaban natin dito, precisely katulad ng sinabi mo, Alex, yung mga mayayamang gobyerno, kasi mayayamang gobyerno captured ng corporations in the first place. Tulad ng binanggit kanina, Butch, meron din tayong engagements patungkol sa OECD, patungkol sa tax justice, patungkol sa tax infrastructure, kung saan gusto nating panagutin yung mga malalaking corporations, lalong-lalo na yung tinatawag na GAFAs, Google, Amazon, Facebook, at iba pang malalaking digital companies, kasi perhaps not surprisingly, ang liit ng taxes na binabayad nila, no? As opposed to ordinary worker, ordinary employer, even upper level managerial employees. So yun, maraming larangan na ginagalawan tayo para labanan yung corporate capture ng government. Baka yung ibang kasama natin, siguro si Ed, baka may pwedeng idagdag.
Tony,
Sige, Karen yes please.
Yung tanong kasi ni Alex, maraming pag-aaral na ang FDC in the past. Yung sa regulatory capture. But this regulatory capture is very much associated with privatization. So, nung privatize nga yung the power system, naku, di alam mo na kung sino mga nakinabang. And then lalo na doon sa very clear ang documentation ng FTC just sa water, yung so marami ng pag-aaral. Ang problem, every administration, siyempre, meron silang mga manok. So, nung binanatan ni Duterte yung Manila Water and Maynilad, bakit dinala sa Singapore for arbitration? And then, siyempre maraming tao natuwa. But on the other hand, ito ba ginagawa niya para kanino? So in the meantime, may mga water system na kinakana naman ngayon ng yung tubig na Bilyar, and then ngayon sa telecom you have the group of Odena, and then you have may kanya-kanya silang paborito. So and then ito nga yung kahit yung bill meron ding paraan para makapasok yung ilan. So by the way, historical lang ito. Nung 1970s, very unpopular po ang mga Hapon sa Pilipinas because of World War II. But because of the pautang, yung mga bilateral, yung ADB, etc., nakapasok ang Hapon at became a regular partner ng Pilipinas. So yung kanilang mga Pan-Philippine Highway, naksangkatutag na pautang ng ADB. Today, yung role na yun, ipapil ngayon ng China, yung Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank at saka iba pang kwan. So ginagamit naman nila ngayon yung bill para ngayon makapasok naman yung itong mga Chinese. Dahil ang mga Chinese, medyo for a long time, hindi naman nakakapagnegosyo sa Pilipinas. So kita mo yung connection ng negosyo at politika. But yung regulatory capture is a very big issue. And then we have this PCC ni Arsenio Balisaca na hindi natin maintindihan ano ang papel niya. Merong rice tarification law, nagreklamo yung mga magsasaka. Ang finding wala namang problema sa issue ng competition. Kung ginagawa ni Balisaca yung trabaho niya, dapat ang tinignan niya yung sino yung right after the tarification, sino yung wala pang 100 ng big importers na kumuha ng 2 or 3 million tons of rice, bumaha sa Pilipinas, bumagsak. Hanggang ngayon, bagsak ang presyo ng palay. Pero, you see, even yung institution in charge of supposedly regulating the market, softening the market for the poor, mukhang di naman nila ginagawa yung papel nila because yung framework nila is very strange. Hindi ko alam kung naintindihan nila what is real competition and then those preventing yung talagang monopoly.
Okay, salamat Karine sa kaalaman lang ng ilan. Yung binanggit ni Karine na PCC, ito yung Philippine Competition Commission. Nabatay dun sa 2015 law, no? Philippine Competition Law natin. At ina-address nito yung mga issue ng mga cartel at saka mga monopoly. Sige, Kaed, Tadem, baka may gusto kayong idagdag.
Yeah, I think mas appropriate yung term na ginamit ni Rene, yung regulatory capture. Kasi ang kung dapat dito is government should really regulate private business in order to curb abuses, yung excessive profit taking, protection of workers' rights, etc., etc., and also basically protecting yung ano ng government, no? Yung interest ng government in terms of taxation and all other income-generating modes with respect to the private sector. Pero ang nangyayari nga is nagkakaroon ng regulatory capture by the private sector. At hindi lang ito related sa privatization, although medyo dominant ngayon yung form of regulatory capture in the era of privatization. But it has really been always the case that private interests, corporate interests, have always exercised undue influence over government policies, legislation, even over the judicial system. So yun ang isang essential feature of the merger somehow of the state and private capital, finance capital, and other forms of capital within the framework of capitalist societies. Unavoidable talaga ito at nangyayari ito. It doesn't matter whether you are a highly advanced industrial country like the US or a less developed country like the Philippines. The same phenomenon exists.
Maraming salamat, Ed. Meron pang gusto magdagdag dun sa topic na regulatory capture. Nagsisimula to dun sa tanong na pinost ni Alex. Kung wala na patungkol sa regulatory capture ng gobyerno by corporations, baka meron pang ibang tanong or iba pang comments.
Ed, magpapaalam ako. Tony.
Oh, sige. Sige.
Salamat Sina, salamat Rene. Salamat Tony.
Okay, maraming salamat. Yes, please go ahead.
Pero bakit bukas ng umaga eh? It's midnight here eh. Past midnight.
Oo nga pala, no?
Sige.
Sige, maraming salamat, Butch.
Alright,
so,
sige.
Sige. Salamat, Butch.
Maraming
salamat, Zina. Nice to meet you, ha?
Yes, sir. Maraming salamat talaga po. At sa susunod po sana ang mga susunod pa nating mga webinar on financialization and debt per se, makasama po ulit namin kayo. At we're doing this precisely because of the upcoming Global Week of Action. At binanggit nyo na din po yung discussion na ng mga IMF World Bank ay paparating na rin po ngayong October 10 to 17. So, yun. We really would like to be with you. Kayo po ay makasama pa rin namin sa tuloy-tuloy na mga discussion. And really, thank you very much, Sir Butch.
Okay. Maraming salamat.
Salamat, Butch.
Salamat, Tony. Salamat, Rene.
So, Sir Tony, go.
Okay, sige. Meron pang additional questions? So maganda yung topic maganda yung discussion patungkol sa corporate capture. I guess kasing importante nung financialization yun.
Yun, siguro at this point, if I may po, kung wala namang
Please.
walang mga tanong na, I would like also to just invite everyone. Ito po ay isa lang din sa ating mga series of webinars ng Freedom from Debt Coalition. And may mga susunod pa po tayo, abangan po every Tuesday po ito. So hopefully next week, we can also have Sir Alex again. May binabanggit po si Ma'am Liddy, yung shadow banking and shadow financing na binanggit nyo kanina. Medyo napakahalagang usapin din yan at napakalaking implication sa pinag-uusapan natin tungkol sa kwento ng, yun nga, automatic, dapat ba default ng gobyerno ay mangutang na lang ng mangutang, lalo na sa panahon ngayon ng pandemya na ang sinasabi, they cannot afford that to get loans or borrow money because we don't have the money. But sa sinasabi kanina po ni Sir Butch, actually the problem is not having or the lack of money, but mainly where is the money and how do our governments get those to correct our policies, to push for policies that will benefit our nation or like the Philippines, and put that money, the money out there, lalo na sa kwento ng pangungutang. Yung dapat po ang mga tinitingnan na natin dyan, and this is where we are coming from as FDC, the Freedom from Debt Coalition, na i-push at push ang ating gobyerno na i-maximize kung meron mang mga loans dyan, pero hindi yan ang automatic na gagawin, kundi iayos ang ating mga terms and conditions in getting those loans that we will not affect us or impact us in the later years. Right now, ang bilis-bilis isipin kung sa common masa, sa mamamayang Pilipino, ang tanong lang, sige, kung wala tayong pera, sige, mangutang tayo. Pero ang basic na tanong lang nila talaga dyan, pag nangutang po ba tayo, nakikinabang ba kami dyan sa inuutang na yan? As we have been discussing ngayon, kanina pa po, mula sa senior ni Sir Walden Bello at ni Sir Butch Montes, it seems na hindi, ang problem natin is the policies, not where the money is. So baka yun po. At this point, I would like to invite everyone po na tuloy-tuloy pa po ang magiging discussion ng ganito ng FDC. And in the upcoming Global Week of Action for Debt Cancellation, we are pushing together with all other debt movements in the world. Kailangan, at gusto ko ring emphasize dito yung challenge ni Sir Butch kanina, na we have to have a unified position then, lalo na sa South countries, developing countries like the Philippines, together with the other developing countries out there, na unified position on this debt cancellation issue. Yun lang po, dagdag lang siguro para lang, basically we will be also be ending soon because mag-aalauna na po. So back to you, Sir Tony. If there are other questions, yan po.
Okay, maraming salamat, Zina. Meron pa pong additional questions or additional comments, inputs? Mukhang napakayaman nung discussions natin at mukhang na-exhaust natin lahat ng mga posibleng angles. At syempre, next week yung shadow banking, no? Mahalaga yun. Naalala ko pa yung panahon na meron pang tinatawag na Binondo Central Bank. Hindi ko alam kung wala na yata yun. Ewan ko kung merong relation yun dun sa current shadow banking. Kung wala na, siguro i-turn over ko sa iyo, Zina, for closing remarks, ways forward. Siguro baka closing remarks ni Karene, ni Dr. Rene Freneo.
Okay na ako. Maraming salamat sa lahat. And see you sa mga susunod na paghaharap.
Okay, salamat, Karene. Over to you, Zina.
Yes po. Thank you very much. Actually, yun yung kaninang spiel ko din na para lang ma-locate natin why we are still doing this. And we are actually live po. So, i-monitor lang po sa mga nanood at nandito ngayon sa room kasama natin. I would like really to give very much appreciation for Sir Dr. Walden Bello as our main discussant. And then also Sir Butch, actually Manuel Butch Montes. And specific mention po, thank you very much Sir Alex Aquino Bagamat you mentioned na hindi na muna sa main, pero you have given us very much, so much input po. And we hope nga po makasama namin kayo, baka pwedeng kayo rin po ang main natin for the next on the shadow banking, as a very expert in finance, capital, and the issues of bank. With that, I would like to thank everyone and lahat po ng nanood mula sa ating nanonood ngayon sa Facebook, live streaming po ito at sa YouTube. And for those who have not, you can also follow through again. Just open, tuloy-tuloy pong naka-streaming ang replay nito sa ating YouTube. Just type in fdcphils.org sa YouTube. Just type in FDC Philippines. Papasok po kayo sa channel ng FDC and then you just look at all the other webinars including this latest. Also sa Facebook, tuloy-tuloy lang po ang uploading nito. So with that, it's already 1:45. And I would also like to thank Sir Tony. Thank you very much for moderating this webinar.
Salamat.
And we hope to have you back. All of you po, lahat ng mga nakikinig, nanonood. Marami pong nagko-comments kanina eh. Pero ang isang major tanong lang nila po ay more ganitong discussions pa po. We hope to have them also in the room. But because we're using only a limited access for people, maximize po natin ang ating live streaming sa Facebook pages ni FDC at ng YouTube page natin po. So with that, siguro let's have a good lunch and maraming salamat.
Zina.
Opened a new or a continuing discussion. Yes, Sir Tony, go ahead.
Pasalamatan natin si Didi Nakpil ng APMDD at saka si Ed Taden ng University of the Philippines.
Yes. Yan po, binanggit nyo na po. So, reiteration lang din, maraming salamat sa lahat ng sumama dito ngayon, including yung mga naging active participant po natin, giving their reactions and questions, clarifications. Yes, Ma'am Liddy is actually our lead ngayon dito sa punong abala, kumbaga sa ginagawa nating Global Week of Action. So, abangan po natin, makasama mula ngayon until the next 2 weeks of October. More discussions and online protests will be happening together with FDC. Kasama po tayo dyan sa Asian People's Movement on Debt and Development, raising these questions, raising the issues of, lalo na sa panahon ng pandemic, hindi dapat na lumulubog lalo tayo sa utang. Na ngayon, hindi natin nararamdaman yan, pero in the next 2 to 3 years, with all the debts that we have been incurring, at yung important question ng, apart from the external debts, itong growing domestic debts na pinag-usapan na rin natin kanina, mahalaga talaga ang pag-usapan ng husto yan. And together with our government, for our government to hear our critical positions and proposals so that the Philippines, together with the other developing countries, will actually move out from the cycle of debts, poverty, and inequality. So with that, yun na po yung huling mga salita siguro natin. Exactly going to by 1 o'clock already. Again, maraming salamat po sa lahat ng nakapanood, sa lahat ng nakinig, at lahat ng mga kasama natin, ang mga board officers po ng Region Secretary Generals of our regional chapters ay also with us in this room. And maraming ulit salamat sa lahat ng other ating experts na sumama. Tuloy-tuloy po sana tayo sa susunod pang mga pag-uusap.